Hey e-commerce marketing podcast listener, I wanted to let you know that we have created 16 e-commerce marketing videos for you. You can download these free videos by visiting ecommercemarketingpodcast.com/videos or by texting the word videos to +1 480 418 1411. These step-by-step video marketing tutorials will teach you how to drive more traffic to your e-commerce website, how to get more backlinks to your e-commerce website, and how to optimize your website to get more paid customers. Get the videos right now by visiting ecommercemarketingpodcast.com/videos or by texting videos to +1 480 418 1411. Welcome to the e-commerce marketing podcast. Today's guest is Peter Zaff from globalsources.com. Welcome to the podcast, Peter. How are you doing?
Doing well, Robert. Hey, thanks so much for having me on today.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I was stumbling your last name, but it's Zaff, Z-A-P-F.
I know it. Everybody has trouble pronouncing it, so you're like in the majority. Yeah, okay. It's pronounced just like Z-A-F-F, even though it's pronounced Z-A-P-F. So okay. You're good.
Yeah, so it's fine, listeners. So just go to Peter Zaff. You can Google Peter Zaff. And again, he's from Global Sources. And Peter, why don't you just tell us a little bit about yourself?
Oh, yeah, sure. No, I work with Global Sources based in Hong Kong. Spent the last 15 years over in Hong Kong and Singapore and Asia with Global Sources that whole time, where we help manufacturers and suppliers connect with overseas importers, wholesalers, and retailers. And what we're seeing is a lot more of the entrepreneurial e-commerce guys get involved in the importing game. That's a kind of a big change we've seen over the past 15 years.
Okay, so you just work as the middle person?
Well, so what we do is we're kind of the platform that kind of helps the two connect. We're not a trading company. Transactions don't go through us. We help the suppliers market themselves or the buyers find suppliers. And we do that through both our website and through trade shows.
Okay. So yeah, a lot of our listeners sell their own products online, and a lot of them do have interest in finding suppliers from China. So what are kind of like some tips or hacks you can give us on how to find suppliers in China?
Yeah, well, you've kind of got two choices, right? One is to do it online, which is great because you can do that anytime or year-round. And there you can use sites like ours, globalsources.com, to go do a search, send an inquiry to the supplier, or preferably multiple suppliers, get feedback from them, order samples from them, request samples, and review the product. So that's one approach, and that works fine. Plenty of the more experienced folks, or folks that are, say, sourcing full-time or working for the larger retailers, they'll take the next step and then actually visit suppliers usually during trade show season, so they can see lots of suppliers at one time. And the trade shows with the China suppliers tend to be in Hong Kong or Guangzhou. Hong Kong has our shows, the Global Sources shows, the HKTDC shows from the Hong Kong Trade Development Council, and in Guangzhou is the Canton Fair. And those shows run twice a year. There's usually three sets of show dates. For our shows, we do a 4-day show on electronics, another 4-day show on mobile electronics and gift and home products, and another 4-day show on fashion accessories. And those shows will have about 3,000 booths of suppliers at our show in Hong Kong. And really, in terms of visiting shows, I'd say the first thing to look at is which product categories do the shows cover. What we've seen is a lot of buyers come over and they'll visit 1, 2, or 3 shows, depending on which categories they're most interested in. And that's why all the organizers kind of arrange their shows at the same time. So kind of two options. One is online. The other is visiting the shows and meeting the suppliers face-to-face and touching their products. Okay.
And for somebody who's just getting started and they really want to find a supply in China because they want to bring down their costs, eventually to increase their profits, without coming to the show and just doing it online, can they successfully get a supplier online and still have everything go well and be able to trust the supplier? Or would you recommend that they get a representative to go to some of these trade shows? Or is online really sufficient enough?
Definitely, there's plenty of people that are successful doing it online themselves. So absolutely, you can be successful that way. That's not to say that everybody does it that way, and there are advantages to going to shows also, but there are disadvantages. The shows only run twice a year. But that doesn't mean that you're guaranteed to be successful if you go online or if you go to shows. It's just like any other business. You need to understand the steps. You need to run them properly. You need to understand where the risks are going to be. And you need to manage those risks appropriately. And probably two of the areas that we see people ask a lot of questions around are pricing and quality. And both of those are discussions and negotiations and communications you need to have with the suppliers.
Okay, so can you give us the steps that somebody needs to take when they're narrowing down their search online?
Yeah, no, definitely. So that a lot of that is about communication, and it's interesting because being at Global Sources, being kind of like you said earlier, in the middle of the buyers and suppliers, sometimes the buyers contact us and say, "Hey, we had a problem with the supplier," and what we see is we call those commercial disputes. And it's funny because the buyers always talk to each other about, hey, these are the problems we have with the China suppliers. But on the flip side, the China suppliers are always talking to each other about, hey, these crazy buyers, here's the problems we're having with them. So when we see these commercial disputes, I'd say very roughly half the time it's the buyer's fault and half the time it's the supplier's fault. But at the end of the day, it's a communication problem. And in order to avoid communication problems, these are the steps that we like to see people go through. The first, like we said, is, get samples. Second is when you get the samples, write down what you don't like about them, which will become your quality control criteria. And it becomes a quality control checklist. When you issue your purchase order, issue it with your quality control criteria. And some suppliers will say, oh, we can't meet that QC criteria. And actually, that's a good thing because you want to learn that they can't meet your QC criteria as early as possible. After the suppliers accepted both the PO and the QC criteria, that's when you make your initial payment, usually 30%. Also, when you send the supplier the PO, tell them, hey, I'm going to have a third-party inspection done before our product ships. So now you've given the supplier QC criteria and told them you're going to get an inspection done. So now you have clear communication about your expectations, and you've indicated that you're going to check against these expectations before product ships. So after the supplier's done manufacturing, hire a third-party QC company. Costs about $300, $250 to $300 for a one-man day of effort. They'll come and check the product against your QC criteria. They'll send you a report with photos, and then you decide whether or not the product meets your QC criteria. And if it does, then you pay the remaining 70%. And what we see is when there are commercial disputes, typically the buyer didn't go through this kind of process. And typically, if he would have gone through this kind of process, a commercial dispute would have been avoided. So that's kind of a good process that we like to see folks go through.
Okay, and for your website, Global Sources, is that something that you walk people through just to go through those steps?
We use education opportunities like this to let people know what we think best practices are. The larger companies have all of these practices in place. And the larger companies, the Walmarts, the Best Buys, the Auchans, the Kingfishers, that have been using our services for many years, they have basically departments to handle each part of this, right? They've got a merchandiser, they've got an inspection guy, they've got a logistics guy. Really, with the onset of e-commerce and the access that smaller, more entrepreneurial people have to sourcing from China, we see that there's more education required. So we don't force anybody to follow this process, but we do try to do education outreach efforts like this to let folks know that we think that would be a good process to follow.
Okay, and if you go through this process and you successfully find a supplier you want to work with, how do you negotiate with that supplier to get the best price?
Yeah, so pricing, quality are kind of probably the two key things. We talked about quality first, which is great. Pricing is interesting. I was talking to another friend of mine, Mike Bellamy, who works for Passage Makers, who provides sourcing services, and he said, I asked him this question. He said, look, it's not a poker game where, the supplier says $1.50 and I say $1. And I totally agree with that. But I feel like some people treat it like a poker game, right? Hey, the supplier said $5. I know that's got to be high. So I'm going to offer, I don't know, $3.50. And the thing is, are you more interested in price or more interested in quality? A story from a few years ago, the guys at the China Law Blog wrote this one up. They were working with a buyer who had ordered bags to carry computers, kind of computer cases. And the buyer had received them, and basically when you put a computer in it, the handle broke, right? It couldn't hold the weight of a computer. So these guys went and talked to the supplier, and the supplier said, look, they told me they wanted a bag, and they wanted the $4 version of the bag. If they wanted the version of the bag that could carry the weight of a computer, they needed the $6 version of the bag, but they wanted the $4 version of the bag. So, when you negotiate down on price, you have to be careful about what's going to happen on the quality side. That being said, you still want to try to make sure you're getting a fair price. And we've seen two broad ways to do this. I think one way that entrepreneurial e-commerce sellers can do, and the other way that's harder. The easier way to do it is just go get multiple quotes. Often the products that folks are sourcing are not that unique, so it's not that hard to go find multiple suppliers and get quotes from each of them and compare the quotes and see what the market's telling you. And that's we've seen the large retailers do exactly the same thing. So get at least 3 quotes, or more, and just start comparing them along with the samples and the quality to see what you're able to get. And then it's a conversation with the supplier. Hey, Mr. Supplier A, I really want to work with you, but Supplier B, he gave me a more competitive quote. Are you able to match what he gave me? And I think that works pretty well. The second approach, which is much more difficult, is to do bottom-up pricing. And that's where you try to figure out, okay, what are the costs of the raw materials or components that are in the product? What's the labor cost associated with getting it, cut or whatever? And what's a factory margin, a fair factory margin? And put those numbers together and say, okay, this is what the price of the product should be. So those are your two broad approaches. One is get multiple quotes. The other is bottom-up pricing. And I think the multiple quotes is much easier.
Okay. And just out of curiosity, how long does this whole process take from your estimation, the first time, from the time you start finding the supplier, going online, getting samples, communicating back and forth, finding multiple quotes? Would you say it takes 2 weeks? If I was to start this right now, would it take a month? How soon can you get things going, just from the time you find the supplier to the time you have your product ready to sell?
I'd say a month is not a bad estimate, but let's talk about what would slow it down or what would accelerate it.
Okay.
The first thing, as you know, China's in a different time zone. So, if you're willing to work overnight, and if you're willing to get maybe on WeChat instead of email, you can have very fast back and forth conversations with the suppliers. And you can get from, hey, I found you, to you will send me a sample at this price to this address within a couple hours if you're on WeChat, just going back and forth, for example. Now, your next question is going to be, does the supplier have product in stock ready to ship, or do they have to manufacture a bit? So that could take 1 day to, 7 or 10 days. Then there's the shipping time, give it 3, 4, 5 days. And then there's your review of the product and the multiple products, is you're going to try to get samples from multiple factories. And then there's the writing up the QC criteria, which I like to see people do, and then sending the PO and the QC criteria to the supplier. So that part, 2 to 3 weeks, could be faster if the supplier has product in stock. Then probably what takes the longest, and it varies a lot by product, is how big is your order and how long is it going to take the supplier to manufacture the product. If they don't have it in stock, then you're talking probably at least, I think 30 days is very common. 15 days is somewhat common from when they receive the down payment from your purchase order until product is ready. If you're buying during peak season, like now is peak season because everybody's buying to get their stock in place for Christmas, it could take longer. If you order during slower season would be like April or May, then it could be faster.
Okay. And what are some horror stories that you've seen, and what are some things that frustrate you about this whole process?
I think that, I hate to use the word horror stories, but there are definitely commercial disputes, and
Okay.
Usually they're going to be commercial. Usually they're going to be communication issues. You're dealing with people in a foreign language. English is usually not the China supplier's first language, with different customs in a different time zone. Really, you need to over communicate. And if you think that it's like going to Walmart, buying something off the shelf with the expectation that it's going to be perfect, the suppliers, they're shipping to many different types of buyers with many different types of requirements and many different types of countries. So you need to be super clear about your requirements. Now, probably a second thing that I think buyers need to be aware of is around regulatory requirements. So historically, suppliers basically do what the buyer asks them to do, which means the suppliers really don't know much about regulatory requirements, let alone the regulatory requirement regimes in the 200 different countries they could potentially ship to. Legally, the buyer, who's the Amazon seller, is the importer of record bringing goods into the U.S. and has legal responsibility to ensure that goods meet regulatory and safety requirements. So I think that a lot of the entrepreneurial folks need to make sure that they're doing the research to understand what the regulatory requirements are around the products that they're importing and making sure that those are being met. So that's not necessarily a horror story area, but I think it's an area that could get folks into trouble. And on the safety side, we saw that a bit with the hoverboards this past Christmas, where a lot of folks had inventory, basically, I think, disposed of by Amazon.
Yeah, it's good that you mentioned that it's very important for the entrepreneur to know, okay, what are some of the legal things that you have to pass in your country? What are some other tips that you could give people who are interested in this process that could just help them find the right supplier and just help them go through the whole process and find what they're looking for?
Do you mean for sourcing or regulatory compliance?
Just for sourcing, what are some of the tips that you would give people, or some things that
Sure.
Yeah.
I think a lot of folks will say with a supplier, start with a small order first, and there's a lot of good reasons for that. One is that you can make sure that the payment process works fine and smoothly. Second is you can make sure that the kind of small mass production run, maybe a couple hundred pieces, a few hundred pieces, matches the same quality as the samples that you received. And it's really a risk mitigation step. And a lot of the things that you want to do are really around risk mitigation. When I talked about communication earlier, that's really around risk mitigation. When I say right now, do a smaller initial order and then ramp up to larger orders, again, that's about risk mitigation. The pre-shipment inspection and doing that in the factory on the supplier side, again, that's about risk mitigation so that you can be comfortable that when your product gets to your warehouse, it's ready to ship, and so that you don't have to inspect it when you receive it. Because if you're inspecting it in the U.S., how are you going to get it fixed? It's not like you're going to be able to ship it back to the supplier in China. Mm-hmm. So just kind of thinking about the process and putting a lot of risk mitigation steps in place to ensure you get product at the level of quality that you're looking for is good. Another one that we've seen that doesn't really happen that often, but to be aware of, is with the, call it wire transfer fraud or bank transfer fraud. So there's two types of things that we'll see. One is the supplier's email got hacked and a bad guy got in, and bad guy sends email to supplier's customer saying, hey, we've changed bank accounts. For your next order, can you wire your money to this new bank account? The second similar example would be a rogue employee. So somebody gets fired or leaves the company and then emails the buyer and says, oh, hey, we've changed our bank account. So the point is, anytime that you're doing wire transfers and you see a changed bank account, double or triple check that change. And don't double or check it. Don't double check it with just the person you've been talking to. Find a different phone number to call the company and talk to folks at the company to make sure that those wire transfer instructions and the banking details have changed. And that's an area that if you have questions about that and it's a Global Sources listed supplier, you can call us up and we can double check that.
Okay, Peter, thanks a lot for sharing all these tips for finding China suppliers. If listeners wanted to reach you, how can they reach you?
Yeah, you can contact us through customer service on globalsources.com. Also, I'm at our trade shows, so if you do come out to our trade shows, look me up. And then the third thing, very quickly, run a Global Sources Summit, and I'll be there as well. That's a 3-day summit co-located with our trade show, targeted as Amazon sellers. We've got some great speakers at this the coming summit in October, including Anchor, 0 to 300 million in 5 years. So they're going to do a really nice presentation. We've got about 18 speakers. You can learn more about that at globalsources.com/summit, and I'll be there as well. So lots of ways to reach me.
Okay, any final thoughts you have about finding suppliers?
No, I think it's just a balance between don't be so scared that you don't do anything, but don't go so fast that you do a lot of stuff wrong. Try to find the right balance, do a lot of reading, and put those risk mitigation steps in place and communicate well with the supplier. And that'll increase the odds of success.
Okay, I know this is just the last question that just came to mind right now. Okay, so I know you deal with China, but are there other countries that people can source from?
Oh, yeah, no, there are a ton of countries, and each country has different kinds of products and product categories. Bangladesh is getting better for gloves and garments. India is good for scarves and shawls, and we have Indian suppliers at our fashion accessories show. Pakistan also has a lot of home products. So different countries specialize in different products. A lot of stuff is still coming out of China.
Okay, okay. And with global sources, do you deal with all those countries you just mentioned or just China?
We do deal with all of those countries, but to be fair, and I don't know what the percentage, but a significant majority of the suppliers we have listed on the site and a significant majority of the suppliers at our trade shows are China, Hong Kong, or Taiwan suppliers.
Okay. Yeah, that's good to know. And now this is the final question. What is the one thing an e-commerce business can do right now to help the business grow, get traffic, or get sales?
Wow, just one thing. I think that I've been looking at this a little bit more Amazon specific, but I think it's important to get quality right. If you don't get your product quality right, you're not going to get the word of mouth. You're going to have returns, which messes up your margins, and you're not going to get good reviews on Amazon. So getting the right focus on product quality, I think, pays greater dividends than maybe a lot of people realize. So, notwithstanding having the right product fit and the right price, if you can also get quality right, I think that you can be in really good shape.
Okay, Peter, I really appreciate you coming on the show, and I've enjoyed your talk and everything that you've shared with us, Peter. So thank you.
Robert, thanks for having me on. It was great.
Thank you for listening to the E-commerce Marketing Podcast. Join the E-commerce Marketing Podcast Facebook group to learn, connect, collaborate, and grow with other e-commerce marketers at ecommercemarketingpodcast.com/FB. ecommercemarketingpodcast.com/FB. Subscribe to us on iTunes by searching for E-commerce Marketing Podcast, and please leave a rating and a review. Thank you for listening. See you next time.